Hameed Haroon, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
You're in London, but back home in Pakistan, there is a great deal of noise, energy, vibrancy to the last couple of weeks of campaigning in the Pakistani elections. And yet you say that democracy in your country is threatened. It is in grave danger. Why?
I think, Steve, the fact of the matter is that democracy without representative government or responsible government is not really democracy. And if on the path to democracy, or on path to mopping up a militancy, or on the path of trying to create a new social architecture in Pakistan, if you're going to play around with the institutions of democracy, you're going to do grave damage to its possibility under a new political dispensation.
But in particular, you're pointing a finger at the Pakistani military. In a recent op-ed in the Washington Post, you wrote this: there is an unprecedented assault by the Pakistani military on the freedom of the press. Now, Pakistan has got a very difficult, sometimes toxic history of relations between the military and the media. Are you seriously suggesting that right now, amid all this noise and vibrancy of an election campaign, there is an unprecedented assault on the free media?
This has been about 2 years in the making, but in the last 3 months, the intensification is major. I think that in the last 3 months, all attempts are being made to mop up critical media, independent media. The largest focus of the attack are the 3 oldest media groups, the 3 oldest newspapers, the Jung News, Combine, the Navai Vakht, and Dawn.
Which is, of course, your group.
That's right.
Yeah, but Dawn is still publishing. Dawn is still able to give its independent voice to coverage of the election. Again, this notion of yours that something truly critical to the future of democracy is happening seems to fly in the face of the evidence on the ground. And I'm reminded of that phrase in the English language of never make the perfect the enemy of the good. Maybe things aren't perfect in Pakistan's democracy today, but if they are better than they have been at points in the past, maybe that's worth celebrating.
I think that it would be wrong to say that things are better than they've been in the past. I think one could dangerously assume that things are not as bad as they might be. But on the inside, I think an independent press, if we had a quiet, acquiescent press like East Asian countries do, or like many Middle Eastern countries do, it might not be such a great loss. But despite everything else, and despite the battering that Pakistan's press has taken over the last few decades, I think it is a vibrant press. And we have almost an obligation to try and keep a vibrant press active not only for people in Pakistan, but for across those in South Asia and that part of the Asian continent.
But you also surely have an obligation not to exaggerate. So let's get to specifics. What are you saying is happening? And you say the last few months have been critical. What has been happening in recent months that, in your opinion, is so very dangerous to freedom of expression and a free press?
I think for the first time, and in this capacity, I think I represent not only Dawn, but the 400 newspapers and magazines of the All Pakistan Newspaper Society, which I'm president of. It is my task as the president of the All Pakistan Newspaper Society to represent the threats and dangers and
what are? I mean, I need to get to the specifics. Otherwise, you will stand accused at home, not least by the military, who are very angry that you've been raising such a stink here. You'll be accused of misrepresentation. So give me the facts. What are the specifics?
I think the first part of it has to do with the massive intervention in the distribution system of newspapers and of blocking television broadcasts in Pakistan.
So Dawn obviously has a distribution throughout the country. Are you saying your newspaper cannot now be read by the people who want to read it across the country?
In large parts of the country, it can be read, and in equally large parts, it cannot be read. In certain cities like Larkana, till 24 hours ago, they haven't seen Dawn for 2.5 months. I think that blockading television broadcasts...
Who's blocking it?
Well, if we were to believe the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Reporters Sans Frontières, and if we were to believe the International Press Institute, then they clearly indicate the military is blocking it. And the reason for this assumption, I think, is that the state institutions are acting with impunity. Clearly, in Nawaz Sharif's government, it wasn't Nawaz Sharif that was blocking it. In the prime ministership that followed subsequently of Shahid Khaqan Abbasi, it wasn't the government and the executive.
You're talking about what, some sort, as the phrase goes, some sort of dark state or
I'm
deep
talking
state
of a deep state. I'm talking of mistakes in military strategy. I don't think the military has decided it is their task to demolish democratic institutions forever. I think there's a mistaken strategy. I think it's poorly conceived. It's on the eve of the elections. It's so widespread. It's not a single incident.
Let me quote to you, if I may, because you're making these charges on Hard Talk. Let me quote to you the words of Major General Asif Ghafoor, who says, he's the spokesman for the army, he says, they have never tried to dictate, or still less intimidate, any media group or journalist, and the military is determined not to be dragged into politics.
Of course, I think that Major General Asif Ghafoor, who's a bright man, would have difficulty explaining his role at the press conference, where he put up pictures in front of all the journalists of social activists, of other journalists and anchors from television, and declared that they were enemies of the state. It was almost an incitement to aggression and coercion against these people.
Some bloggers and some journalists have been threatened, some have been detained. Well, you can call it abducted if you like. There was the famous case of Gul Bukhari, who disappeared for a short while, and many called that an abduction. So let us just be clear here, are you saying that elements in the armed forces, presumably under command, are going out and abducting journalists, threatening their lives?
I am saying that in the eyes of the public, there is a perception, and in the eyes of the human rights and international press organizations and the human rights organizations in Pakistan, there is a strong perception that because of the impunity with which these abductions take place and the fact that there is no accounting for it, no holding anybody responsible or picking up anybody as a consequence, they go on without comment. We have appealed to international bodies, we've appealed to the Pakistan government, to the Supreme Court, to the Chief of Army Staff, and to the caretaker Prime Minister. And surely, if you were not involved, you would at least look into the matter and give some report about why these are happening at such a perpetual basis. For the last 3 months, the Freedom Network, which compiles incidents from 8 press clubs in Pakistan, shows a massive intensification.
Well, let's bring this close to home. Have your own journalists in the Dawn Media Group been intimidated and threatened? Have they actually experienced this?
I think there's been a level of attempted intimidation when on the social media as a result of a joint investigation team in which the military is included, when the personal phone numbers and the mobile numbers and the addresses of people being investigated are put on social media, this becomes an incitement for people to attack them.
Are your journalists living in fear?
I think not only my journalists, but a large number of journalists from Pakistan are deeply complaining about the self-censorship they've been forced to impose upon themselves.
Well, that's an interesting phrase, self-censorship. There's one particular story that has been very important in Pakistan in recent months, and that is the rise of this movement, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which has been demanding answers from the military about alleged disappearances, extrajudicial killings in parts of the country, particularly tribal areas of the country in the recent past. Now, the allegation from journalists is that they have been required, not least by their own media organizations, not to report on the rise of this movement because the military doesn't want this movement to get publicity. Is that happening in your media organization?
I think with respect to the Pashtun movement, it's terribly clear that there are instructions work 2 ways. To give them and to accept them are 2 different things. But yes, there is a high degree of complaint from a large number of media houses, newspapers and television channels that the government will not tolerate.
You haven't directly answered my question. I mean, you're the boss of Dawn. You must know whether inside your own organization there are journalists who are not reporting on something that they feel they ought to report upon because they are being intimidated.
With one qualification, that Dawn has an autonomous editorial setup and the editors take such decisions. But yes, there is pressure and there have been attempts by the military to clamp down on those media who are reporting the Pakhtun movement.
Now, I'm a journalist, so of course I'm inclined to always want to defend the freedom of journalists, but, you know, I also have to consider what's happening in Pakistan today. There is a real security problem in Pakistan. We just saw yet again in Peshawar a suicide blast which killed a senior politician. Again, very close to the run-up of the election. We've got the army and the military saying that the election itself, they believe, could be targeted. Other politicians have been named as potential targets. The army has a duty to the people of your country to secure the country first and foremost. Now, is it not a real possibility that the kinds of things you are saying, the inflammatory language you're using, is undermining the ability of the military to meet that duty?
I think, let me say, first of all, that I have a tremendous admiration for the steps taken to curb the militancy over the years by the army, but that admiration does not extend to a misconceived policy of trying to browbeat the media, of trying to intimidate the media, and of trying to prevent newspapers and television from getting information across for an election. I think partial democracy.
But my point is slightly different. My point is that the way you're using your language and the inflammatory ideas you're spreading undermines the army, first of all, the military's ability to safeguard the election without people then thinking, oh my God, all of these troops are around the polling stations, they must be trying to fix it in some way, because you've planted that seed of doubt about their neutrality into people's heads.
I think, to be terribly fair, the media is not quite as powerful, Steve, as you say. I think that it is the military which has planted the seed of doubt with respect to the execution of their policies. And I think
so when you see, and we understand from the Pakistani Election Commission that they've called for literally hundreds of thousands of serving and retired security force personnel to be on duty at polling stations around the country on election day, July 25th. Are you saying to me that that will fill you with fear?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that will be a good step to prevent the polling process from going wrong. But I'm speaking of the atmosphere of pre-poll rigging, which has taken place, where the selection of candidates, the decapitation of political party heads, the instituting of cases and investigations against politicians at different levels. I'm not against the accountability process. I'm not for corruption in the political system, but I'm against a selective application of this.
Yes, and now you've put it out there, let's get to the real nub of this in many ways. Certainly the military might see it that way. You've just talked about what you see as a decapitation strategy that you say, and have been saying for the last couple of years, has been pursued by the Pakistani military in politics, particularly targeting Nawaz Sharif, who of course was the Prime Minister, then fell foul of a raft of allegations about alleged corruption involving properties owned in London, which he hadn't declared. It forced his resignation, and since then he's even been convicted of a crime. Now, you and your media group, it seems, have chosen to be deeply sympathetic to Mr. Nawaz Sharif. Why have you done that?
I think perhaps you mistake two different phenomena. The first one is that we have carefully put across whatever evidence is available on the corruption of politicians, including Nawaz Sharif and other parties, to the extent that it can be justified or it can be backed up with material in our possession. The problem is not there. I think it is the selective method by which these politicians have been eliminated. I think a fairer playing field, a more level playing field might have been better.
But you've always, if I may say so, and look back at the record, it always seems you've had a bit of a hotline to Nawaz Sharif's people and his interests. For example, going back to 2016, you were the media group who got hold of the leaked report saying that Nawaz Sharif, as Prime Minister, had demanded that the military take action, better, more effective action against terror groups inside the country. It was something that deeply embarrassed the military. They were very angry about it. They wanted to know where you got the leak from. And ever since then, there's been this sort of battle going on between you and the military, primarily over Nawaz Sharif. I just wonder whether it's wise for a journalist to get into that.
I think that we have to be very clear, and I have to state very clearly, that the report in Dawn Leaks was never leaked to Dawn. This Dawn Leaks is a title that was made up by the prosecutors of Dawn. I think that
Well, you published the leaked material. Where it was leaked to is perhaps a little bit immaterial. The point I'm getting to is that you pose here as the defenders of journalistic integrity, independence and impartiality in Pakistan, and yet to many in Pakistan, not least in the military, you are not seen as entirely independent, neutral and impartial, because over the last couple of years you're basically seen to have been increasingly giving a platform to one particular political player, Nawaz Sharif, who has run into an awful lot of trouble because of allegations of corruption.
I was speaking particularly about the fact that there was no leak from Nawaz Sharif or his party. In fact, the news about which Dawn printed in the so-called Dawn leak saga about the conversation with respect to 2 meetings was available at different points in Pakistan and internationally. In fact, that material was procured internationally. It's a verification process.
No, I understand, but let's not get hung up on the technicalities of how this all panned out. But the bottom line is this, and I come back to it. You, the self-proclaimed independent, impartial, neutral media group covering Pakistani politics, are now seen to be supportive and sympathetic of Nawaz Sharif, his daughter, who are now, it has to be said, convicted criminals.
I think what is more important is that there is an element of orchestration in that.
Where's your evidence? Who's orchestrating and where is your evidence for it?
I think that if you go to the social media, if you look at the trolls on the social media, if you look at the attacks on Dawn, you might get some idea that there is a very large presence by the ISPR, or the Inter-Services Public Relations, on the social media.
Pakistani intelligence?
Absolutely.
It's going after you because
Not going after us so much as going after anybody that they feel stands in their way. I think it's important to say that although it's not a contest, we are hardly contenders for straight power. I think basically there's a civil-military narrative which went wrong, and Dawn was the messenger. And a large part of that is shooting the messenger.
You see, you started this interview with the premise that Pakistan's democracy is facing threats and dangers. But you're, in a way, creating those threats and dangers, because you're now telling me that the Pakistani intelligence services are meddling in politics to the extent that they want to, quote-unquote, decapitate one particular important political player, and one can only infer that they therefore have other politicians that they would like to see successful in the forthcoming election. Is that what you believe, that they have favoured candidates? Of course not Nawaz Sharif, who you say they want to decapitate, but others that they want to see in power?
I think there's a preferred face of Pakistan they'd like to see.
Who?
The security forces and the establishment.
No, who do they favour, in your opinion?
I think that at this point there appears to be an attempt to favour second-level string leaders and a patch-up coalition which would rule with direction from the deep state.
Well, you're not using names, but I'm pretty sure that from what you're saying, you mean Imran Khan and his PTI party.
Well, there are times that Imran's index goes up with the security state, and at times other people in his party are named. In every case...
You're throwing out... I mean, you've just said something potentially explosive in Pakistani politics, that Imran's fortunes go up and down depending on the interventions of the deep state and the intelligence services.
And that of many political parties.
Where is your evidence? You're a journalist. You know that you can't say these things without having absolutely irrefutable evidence.
I think that evidence today in Pakistan must, to a certain extent, be looked at through inference, through the work of human rights organizations, through the works of political commentators. I'm not actually making a case against the state. I'm making a case for the state to conciliate itself with the media and try and keep the normal institutions of democracy going.
But you are making a case against the state from the very beginning with this talk of the military trying to undermine freedom of expression and the free press. Of course you're making a case against the state, and it comes back to the credibility of the entire democratic system in Pakistan. You, far from trying to build it up, appear to be trying to sow very grave seeds of doubt about that system.
I'm afraid, Steve, as being the president of the APNS, I'm elected to represent...
That is the overall Pakistani Press Association.
Yeah, I'm elected to represent the rights of the media, the justified rights of the media. There is so much more I could go into, which would perhaps be boring. As far as irrefutable evidence are concerned, so many of the orders given are illegal orders. For example, if you ask me to produce 20 people from different cities, hawkers, ordinary distributors who have been stopped from distributing Dawn and other newspapers.
I get that point, and you've made the point about what's happening on the ground. But before we finish, and we're nearly out of time, I just want you to tell me what you think is going to happen over the next few days. We've got Nawaz Sharif. As we speak, Nawaz Sharif hasn't returned, but he's about to return any moment now to Pakistan. Unclear whether he's going to be detained. And then in a few days' time, we've got the election itself. Everything you're saying to me suggests you have a very bleak view of how this election is going to pan out.
I am perhaps more optimistic than you think, but yes, I always have a bleak view when important provisions of the Constitution, like Article 19, which guarantees freedom of press, and Article 19A, which guarantees freedom of access to information.
But let me put it bluntly. Everything you've said in this conversation suggests to me that when you sit down and watch the election result come out in a few days' time, you will have grave doubts about its validity and legitimacy. And in particular, you know, we talked about Imran Khan. His party only won 30-odd seats last time around. The polls suggest they could win many more this time. They could, maybe not, but they could conceivably be part of a coalition that's governing the country. And you appear to be saying to the people of your country, if that's the case, then you better have very grave doubts about the legitimacy of the next government.
No, I think that the polling process is bound to be reasonably fair. It's a pre-polling process, and the information and dissemination of information leading up to the electoral process, which has been more than a little unfair. And I think that we need to curb that, something we need to change, something we need to improve, so that in the new political dispensation, freedom of press is one of the characteristics that characterizes Pakistan.
A final thought, which isn't about the unknowns of the next few days in Pakistani politics, is a bigger thought. You seem, talking of being bleak, you also seem very pessimistic about the degree to which Pakistani culture and levels of tolerance and openness and sort of dialogue, the degree to which they are not being improved by access to information, the internet revolution, the fact that virtually every Pakistani now has a phone which can wire them immediately to a world of information. You're suggesting that levels of intolerance, not just in terms of the state, but in terms of communities and people in their villages, it's not changing. Is that true?
No, it is changing, and it's changing for the better. But I think we appear to be in a deep transitional period, and it's better to respect democratic institutions during the process of this change to ensure there's a place for it.
But you say unless we change our climate in the country, the cultural climate, unless we alter our basic values, I'd venture to say that however bad pre-partition was, our current situation could be even worse.
I think so. It's the spirit of intolerance with which public service, with which governance, with which public policy is viewed. Obviously, the militants had their effect on Pakistan, but Pakistan is not a militant state. I think Pakistanis, like everybody else in the world, would like to be free. And if I can stand up, however small or however defectively, for that freedom, I feel I'm only doing my duty, and I'll try and put that forward as much as possible.
Hameed